and I will turn the program over to Will Ginsburg. Will?
Dottie, thank you. And I want to welcome everybody, welcome our panelists, and welcome everyone in the audience to today's donor briefing on land use, segregation, and the affordable housing crisis in our state, the state of Connecticut. This is, as Dottie said, great attendance. One of the most heavily attended of all the donor briefings we've done, and I dare say that is these issues are front and center. And they're attracting a lot of attention and focus from people. And that is in very large part due to the efforts and the passion and the work of the three extraordinary women who are on our panel today, who you're going to hear from over the next hour. Just by way of introduction, I would say these are not new issues. Indeed, I remember very well as a law student in the 1970s, which is a very long time ago, studying the first lawsuit that was brought under the regional fair share provisions of the 1974 Housing and Community Development Act. And that was a suit brought by the city of Hartford against the town of Glastonbury and its other suburbs. So these issues are not new in Connecticut. They're quite old in Connecticut. We call them a crisis. I think that's a fair statement. But again, they're not new as a crisis. This issue of housing affordability and segregation and land use is emblematic of Connecticut as a state of gaps between the wealthy and the poor, gaps between Black and brown on the one hand and white on the other, gaps between city and suburb. Too much of our state is characterized by those gaps. So these are issues of equity, and these are issues of opportunity. You will hear a lot of talk, I think, in the next hour about equity and opportunity. As it happens, and it's not a coincidence, the Community Foundation's strategic plan is called Opportunity and Equity. So these issues are really at the heart of how the foundation is trying to achieve, to make Greater New Haven the community that we envision, a community of greater opportunity and greater equity. I said this isn't new. I think what is new is that we are at a moment when we can make progress on these age-old issues that have bedeviled us for so long. We're at a time when sensibilities are changing, when politics is changing, when new leaders and new energy and new ideas are emerging to tackle age-old questions. And this is certainly one of them. So I think I certainly approach these questions today from the perspective of we have an opportunity to make real change. And that new leadership, again, the three women you're about to hear from represent as much as anyone in our state, that new leadership and new ideas and new energy on these issues. No one in Connecticut is more knowledgeable or more committed to seeing change in how segregated and divided Connecticut can become less so in this new decade than our three panelists today. So I'm going to introduce them. I'm not going to go into a lot of biographical detail. We sent you a little bit, and you can look up their extraordinary bios, but they bring a tremendous experience and passion and energy and expertise and knowledge to these issues, as you'll see in a moment. So our panelists today are Erin Boggs, who's the Executive Director of the Open Communities Alliance, Sara Bronin, who is the founder and lead organizer of Desegregate Connecticut, and our moderator is Anika Singh Lemar, who is clinical professor of law at the Yale Law School. So I'm going to turn this over to Anika, who's going to moderate this conversation. And again, I thank Erin and Sara and Anika for joining us today, and for all of you out in the audience for joining us today as well. Anika, take it away.
Thanks, Will. Thank you for having me, and I want to convey my thanks also to Erin and Sara, who have done remarkable labor of love and passion over the last year and longer, really traversing the state of Connecticut, sharing their expertise and knowledge in communities large and small, in church basements and community rooms and over Zoom. And I really appreciate your bringing this conversation to New Haven as well. So, so thank you. So I'm not going to say very much. I want them to do most of the talking today, but I'm going to put it, try to frame some of these questions. I think those of us who live kind of deep in the weeds on housing issues tend to think about the housing crisis in two discrete buckets, obviously related to each other. But there's a problem of housing affordability, one that increasingly affects not only low-income households, but also middle-income households. And there's a problem of housing segregation, which many of the folks here today I know realize is a problem, but may not realize is particularly acute here in Connecticut, even more so than in other parts of the country. So it would be great, I think, for all of us to get kind of a primer on, what's the current state of housing affordability and housing segregation here in Connecticut and why it's a problem. Erin, I'll turn it over to you first.
All right, and it's really wonderful to be here. I am going to just very quickly share a few slides and just to make the point that cannot be made without some good maps about both affordability and segregation in our state. So this map is put out by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's their out of reach assessment they do every year. And they're really looking at which states are facing the biggest challenges with affordability. And Connecticut year after year comes in, usually in the top 10. And currently we have the 10th highest what's called housing wage in the nation, which means that a family earning minimum wage in Connecticut would have to work 96 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. We at OCA have done our own analysis of the need for affordable housing. And even if we're looking just at families who are at the lowest end of the spectrum, making about $30,000 a year for a family of 4, so that's 30% of area median income, and paying more than half of that towards their housing costs, that's 135,000 families. So the need is deep. And then that connects to the other crisis we've been talking about, which is segregation. So we are one of the most segregated states in the country. On this map, the sort of orangish brown areas are in the top 10% of most segregated regions in the state, and Connecticut is right up there, more segregated than any place in the South. So this is really this dual crisis that we're facing. And part of the reason it's so important is because that segregation connects to this notion of opportunity. So we've tried to take a hard look at the kinds of opportunity structures that lead to success in life, especially for kids. And those are things like how the schools are doing, what the median income is in the area, a number of employment factors, including unemployment, and then how the neighborhood is doing in terms of things like crime rate and home ownership. And when you put that all together, you get a map that looks like this. It's our opportunity map. The areas that are dark orange are really thriving. The schools are doing well, the crime rates are low, home ownership rates are high. And in the lightly shaded areas, there is less access to opportunity, greater opportunity isolation, and a need for greater investment. And then we can map this with other things like where families of color are living. So you can see a real trend between where places are opportunity isolated and where families of color are living. And just to dig into the New Haven neighborhood area a little bit more, this is the New Haven region with just Black and Hispanic households and Asian households, and of course, white households are all over the place. Altogether in Connecticut, Blacks and Latinos, 74% of Blacks, 68% of Latinos are living in low and very low opportunity areas, the 2 lowest of the 5 areas that we assess. And that's true for 25% of whites and 32% of Asians. And along with creating a whole lot of other disparities across all kinds of issues like education and health and incarceration and employment, the upshot of this, along with other, practices that have come out of our discriminatory history, like employment discrimination, is that we have some real disparities in income and wealth, particularly for Black and Latino families. So in Connecticut, on average, Black and Latino families are earning half of what white families are earning, and have about a tenth or less of the wealth. With this study that Forbes reported on, it's anticipated that wealth will go down to 1% of what white families are earning. So this is why affordable housing is at the crux of what we're talking about. So I will stop sharing at this point, and we can move on to other topics.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I guess the question was, why is this a problem? And Erin is really the expert on, all of the issues on segregation and housing and its origins in Connecticut. One of the things that, and so she summarized a lot of it. I'll just add a couple of things that we've been looking at through our coalition on Desegregate Connecticut. And as Erin said, there's a huge impact of segregation on individual households and their opportunities, but there's also an aggregate impact on our economy and also our environment, because the very same rules that cause exclusion also cause these ripple effects, unintended, perhaps, on both of those other issues of our economy and our environment. So the same kinds of exclusionary laws, and I'll talk about these probably later in this conversation, but something like large lot zoning, which locks people out of opportunity and is reflected in those maps that Erin showed, also means that we are building one house on huge lots, which encourages us to sprawl further and further outward, which encourages us to eat up farmland and destroy our forest. At the same time, the fact that we have this exclusionary zoning, again, among many other factors, leads to the fact that we cannot build enough housing to keep pace with our demand. So if you look at Connecticut's rate of housing production, the census has just released data that shows that we are dead last in the country. So while the rest of the country over the last year, even during the pandemic, has produced 24% more housing units, Connecticut has produced 20% fewer than a year ago. And again, we are dead last in the country, one of only 3 states to decline in the number of housing units we are producing. If we're not producing housing for the combination of reasons that I think we'll discuss more today, we're not going to be able to have enough opportunities for people to live in not even just the place they want to live, but in any place at all in Connecticut. So these issues are really intersectional, and that's one of the things that we've been focusing on in the way that we've talked about our little piece of the conversation this year is that intersectionality.
Thank you both so much. I think that last point you raised, Sara, is actually a good launching off for my next question. So you cite that statistic that Connecticut's last in the nation in terms of building permits issued. And the response you often get from lay people thinking about this issue is, well, nobody wants to live here. That's why nobody's building housing. And we know that's not true. We know there's high demand for housing in Connecticut because prices are high, right? We know that people want to live here. We know that it's a desirable place to be, again, because it's reflected in the extraordinarily high cost of our housing. And that's just one example of an issue that raises one response from sort of lay people and kind of defenders of the status quo, but where among scholars and commentators, there's actually quite wide consensus across the political spectrum on this question of how we got here, how did this problem get so bad? So while we have very controversial, highly controversial kind of local and state politics on some of these questions, there isn't a lot of scholarly debate about how this problem came to be. So I'm going to turn it to both of you to talk to us a little bit about how we got here. And I think I'd like to start with Erin, if you could walk us through a phrase that's become increasingly common and colloquial, this redlining, and maybe a little bit about how subsidized housing gets located today, and then turn it over to Sara to talk about some of the land use and zoning.
Absolutely, and I will not be able to resist showing another map, only because redlining is so much about how things fit together spatially. So this is a redlining map of New Haven from 1937. Redlining was a process that the government used, the United States government used when it decided to get into the business of promoting home ownership through home loans and backing homeowners insurance. And they decided that they really needed to have a good sense of the stability of the neighborhoods in which they were investing. And to do that, they wanted to assess the stability of all the neighborhoods where they were investing. And one of the sort of foundational pieces of data that they used to assess stability was whether there were a lot of immigrants in the neighborhood, low-income people in the neighborhood, and at the time, Negroes in the neighborhood. So in this map, those areas that were outlined in red really were the redlined areas. And generally, loans were not made there to promote home ownership. Then you would have the yellow areas where it was less likely a loan would be made compared to the blue areas. And then the green areas were places that were green lighted for these kinds of loans. And this is actually the real document that was used by the assessor, how it was filled out for the particular area that was highlighted on the map. And you can see the way it reads. There's an infiltration of Negroes, relief families, meaning people on welfare, many. This is an older section of the city, now given over largely to Negroes employed as domestics, et cetera. So, it was very explicit. There was no doubt that race was a factor, and that was part of why the decision was made. And, combined with other things like racial covenants, which were basically appendages or part of a deed that restricted who could live in a house upon conveyance. And the language we see, all over the place in Connecticut in old deeds is basically, no person other than a person of the white race shall use or occupy this property, except if the person is a domestic servant of a different race than the owner or renter. So this was very clear. It was very explicit. And those are just two examples of the history behind this and how the U.S. government and, state governments and local governments played a very active and intentional role in keeping people separated. You also mentioned subsidized housing, Anika, and I know there are investments made, part of this is investments made by the government even today in where subsidized housing is going. And just so I don't have to put the map up again, the PowerPoint up again, this is a map with opportunity, but also where subsidized housing is in the New Haven region. So these are government decisions about where to invest to create housing that's more affordable. The fact that these are mostly in areas that are more likely to be high poverty, more likely to be Black and Latino, is driven by a couple of different things, including the parameters of those particular programs, how they are prioritized. And a lot of that prioritization comes from the state's priorities that it gets to decide for itself. And another is zoning. An affordable housing developer is not going to be as likely to take on a battle, try to build something if he or she also has to take on a battle to get it built in a place that is going to put up a fight.
Great, and I'll add to that, I'll share a couple of slides too, just by way of background. We're unlike Erin and Anika, I'm not an affordable housing total expert, but the area that we focused on is an area that I've worked in, which is the zoning dimension here. One of the things that our team has done since we assembled in June was we got a group together starting in October through January and just really intensely worked through every zoning regulation in the state. And from that, we have, I think, painted in our zoning atlas, and I put the link down at the bottom of the page there, a picture of how Connecticut regulates its land. And you'll see in this slide, the purple image, the purple areas of Connecticut, so it's a map of Connecticut, obviously, shows where single family housing is allowed as of right. And so Erin just alluded to onerous approval processes. The zoning codes that have as of right processes, really that means that you don't have to go through onerous public hearings, you don't have to go through a special permit process or get a variance or any of those things that you may have heard in news articles as being contentious when it comes to zoning. As of right means you walk into the office, you ask the staff for a permit, they review whether what you've done is in compliance with the zoning regulations, and they issue you the permit. So again, this shows you where in Connecticut single family housing is allowed as of right. And this slide shows you where 4-family housing is allowed as of right. Again, this is a stark contrast, and it just illustrates the point that Connecticut has in the vast majority of its areas, zoning rules that are very restrictive in the kinds of housing that may be produced. Of course, you see that in the little bit of purple here in New Haven, of course, in Hartford, New Britain, those are places where you see more of that 4-family housing being allowed without onerous processes. Just to zoom in on New Haven, here you see our New Haven kangaroo right here, if you can see my cursor. I want to show you where 1, 2, 3, and 4 family is allowed. So here and at the bottom right, you'll see the kind of housing that's allowed. 1-family housing, there's a lot of purple here in these areas, and a lot of the non-purple areas are state lands or public lands. Others are zoned for non-residential uses. So this hot pink here, which is shown on the left, is not shown on the right. So some of these areas that are grayed out are non-residential uses, but anything with a purple tinge allows for single family housing. I go to 2-family housing and you can immediately see, okay, there's a big difference here. Even 2-family housing is not allowed in many towns around New Haven. If you look at Branford, North Haven, Bethany, Woodbridge, you might take a look at Orange and say, wow, Orange is very, very progressive. But there's a note on our map, and if you go to the interactive version, you'll see that that's only for very specific kinds of conversions for historic properties, and or a lot of towns have an elderly only component. So you can only divide a single family into 2 if it's for elderly use. So don't let that fool you. When you get to the 3-family housing, of course, it's even less. When you get to 4-family housing, it's about the same as 3-family, but almost virtually not allowed anywhere outside of the New Haven, East Haven area. So what our zoning atlas was attempting to do was to paint a picture of why we are where we are. To answer Anika's question, how did we get here? How are we, what has caused this? And zoning has played a central role. I will come back to this point about large lot single family zoning, just to say that we also documented among 62 different housing related characteristics for all of the zoning districts in Connecticut, we documented the minimum lot size that's required. For single family housing, 81% of single family zone properties have what's essentially a 1 acre minimum lot size. 50% of that housing has a 2 acre minimum lot size. So when I said at the beginning, many of these issues have overlap on a number of areas, not just equity. That's really what I was talking about, or this really illustrates that point, which is that the large lot zoning, which has an exclusionary effect, also contributes to these other issues as well.
Thank you. I see in the chat a comment about the echo. I think it sounds like it's been resolved, but thank you for pointing it out. I do want to encourage folks to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll have time at the end for questions, but we're also happy to kind of address them as they pop into your mind. So don't hesitate to type at us while we're doing this. I think the kind of work that Desegregate has done in terms of that zoning atlas is pretty singular. We don't have that kind of data for every state in the country, and it's pretty exciting that we have it for Connecticut. But to the extent that people have tried to compare degree of zoning exclusion across states or across regions, I want to be very clear that while these problems are national in a lot of ways. Connecticut's like super bad. So not to be overly colloquial about it, Connecticut's worse than other places. So, you know, Sara just told you that 50% of our single family zones require a minimum 2-acre lot. There's a 5-year-old Fair Housing Act case out of Arizona where the fight was over whether the developer wanted a minimum 6,000 square foot lot and the town wanted him to build minimum 8,000 square foot lots. 8,000 square feet is 1/5 of an acre. So that just gives you a sense of the degree of Connecticut's exclusion. It's really extraordinary. But having said that, there are things to be learned from advocacy around the country and other states and also in DC. So I'm curious to hear from you both. What is exciting to you about things that are happening in other parts of the country? And then we'll bring it back to Connecticut in a minute.
And I'll just mention on the sort of comparative zoning restriction front to Anika's point that it's actually, you know, and this is the interesting thing about zoning, it's really something that kind of runs across political ideologies. So there's a report out from the Cato Institute that leans right, and also a report out from the Brookings Institution that leans left. They both say that Connecticut is one of the most restrictive zoning states in the nation and that it's causing all kinds of problems for Connecticut. So, you know, I think that's important because I think to solve this problem, it really would be helpful to be working across the aisle and bringing in all kinds of people who care about this, whether it's for the restrictions on our economy and how it's holding back business, or whether it's for social justice reasons, like it all comes together, or environmental reasons, as Sara pointed out, it all comes together when we talk about zoning. You know, in terms of solutions, we're at a fantastic time to be really tackling this issue. We have a new administration that has come in Washington, D.C. They're game to tackle this issue. They're game to put some really exciting things all across that are in use all across the country into play. In terms of, you know, outside of the zoning context, there are some great things going on with something called mobility counseling, which is a counseling intervention to work with families who have vouchers, explore with them places they might want to live, and make sure that areas that they may not have considered before are on the table, and they have full information about it, and then helping to make those moves happen if they're possible. And this has worked incredibly well in Baltimore, in Dallas, in Chicago, in Seattle, and we have sort of a nascent program here in Connecticut that we hope will really take off. There are other things in DC, like small area fair market rents, which is a very wonky thing, but actually at its core is about making voucher programs work in all kinds of neighborhoods and reflect the cost of living in different places. In terms of zoning, we have spent really the last 5+ years exploring different strategies being used across the country to address the zoning issue. And we have seen all kinds of things like the use of inclusionary zoning, the use of land trusts, the use of things like accessory dwelling units, and really looked across the country to see what strategy is working the best to break through those zoning barriers in a way that's thoughtful and involves planning, but also successfully promotes integrative housing choices. And the thing that we have landed on that we're really excited about is something we call fair share planning on zoning. It's a process that's in use in New Jersey. There it was born out of, 50 years of litigation, but at the end of the day, what they've come up with is a system that is really working. And what it essentially does is it estimates the need for affordable housing. It allocates that out to regions and then towns in a fair way, and then sets up a planning process that is meaningful for towns to plan to get to their fair share, and for those towns, and hopefully they're few in number that aren't following the rules, an enforcement process. So that's one of the things that I think we're particularly excited about on the zoning front.
You know, other states have been, as Erin said, experimenting with statewide zoning reforms and statewide legislation. And so I'm just going to put in the chat a link to a summary because we don't have time to go into all of those state efforts. But even states like Utah, speaking of a bipartisan arrangement, have given local governments a menu of choices. We've seen California doing statewide ADU legislation and other reforms to process. We've even seen Massachusetts recently, almost unanimously through its legislature, adopt a proposal that had started in the Connecticut legislature this session to zone around train stations to allow for new housing. So again, that just passed in our neighbor to our north, and our legislature is probably not going to do that this session, but it's something that for many, many reasons we need to take a more careful look at. So some states have taken, have also through judicial decisions implemented, as in New Jersey, through administrative agencies, developed fair share and other models like that. So there's been a lot of experimentation from a legislative perspective, and also from a judicial in the judicial opinion side of legal practice. And so I do think it is a time of a lot of really interesting experimentation, and happy to see that we're starting that conversation but we've broken open that conversation in a way over the last year, in part in response to so many things that have been exposed as a result of COVID-19 and our racial injustice longstanding crisis.
I think that echo is back. I think it might be on your end. Okay. One, I'm going to bring it back to Connecticut, and would be remiss if I didn't note that we've had some good news in Connecticut just in the last 24 hours. The House yesterday in Hartford passed a right to counsel for tenants in eviction matters. One unfortunate consequence of our lack of multifamily and rental housing is that tenants are at a disadvantage in the marketplace. There's not enough housing opportunities and housing options available for them. And one sort of consequence of that is that landlords have a ton of market power. And one thing that we can do about that is at least help tenants out in terms of when they're in court on an eviction. 80% of landlords are represented, and the vast majority of tenants are self-represented. So that's a bit of good news. I'm curious to hear from you both about what else you see happening in Connecticut that people might be interested in hearing about, whether it's legislative or otherwise. And I'll turn it over to Sara first.
Sure. So right now in the legislature, there is a bill that Desegregate Connecticut and our 69 organizational coalition members have been promoting. It's called SB 1024. It has emerged the opposite of unscathed, scathed in the legislative process, in that it took out two proposals that we had. I mentioned one about transit-oriented development, another one that would have put 2 to 4 family housing near main streets. But the rest of it emerged from the committee as originally drafted. So our goal right now is to get SB 1024 to the House floor, to get it called for a vote. And it's possible, or we're hoping that actually zoning reform bills will be called all at once, and that we will have some kind of combination of what we've been proposing, other bills that have gone through the legislative process. There's a bill that broke off from our original bill about commissioner training. We hope that comes back in. That fair share, which Erin may be able to talk about in a minute, will hopefully all of this stuff can just go in one package and kind of move forward. But again, the biggest issue right now is really getting legislative leadership to call the zoning reform bills that have made their way through the process. Our bill would, among many other things, it would legalize accessory dwelling units statewide, one of the reasons we have focused on that, and we're excited about that, even if the other parts do not get resurrected this session, is that we've seen what has happened in California. And just over the last couple of months, since there have been studies that have been put out about California's legalization of accessory dwelling units. And what that means is a small unit of housing on the same lot as a main unit. It's created tens of thousands of units of housing. The rents have been categorized by the people who've been studying them as affordable for California. The average size that has been studied is over 600 square feet. So these are not tiny micro units. They are units that could hold, a small family. So we think that that kind of housing, which can help homeowners increase their property values, which can add units of housing in communities where there are opportunity options, and can also help keep people in their homes, and seniors in particular. We've seen a lot of research that shows that many people who are losing their homes or being forced to sell their homes in Connecticut are seniors on fixed incomes. If they can create accessory dwelling units, we're going to help those people stay in their homes. So again, it's definitely not a fix-all. It's definitely a first step, but we're excited about that and hope that 1024 passes. So please encourage your legislators to support it, and legislative leadership to bring that to the floor.
Yeah, and some of the other things that are going on in the state are, as Sara mentioned, the fair share planning and zoning bill. That's House Bill 6611. Actually came basically without changes and with 100% of the Democrats voting for it out of the Planning and Development Committee. And it has stumbled in the Judiciary Committee with a threat from some legislators to basically talk it to death, so other bills would not be heard on the last day that committee was able to move bills out. And so it's not the end of the road. There's really some more opportunities, and our legislative champions are looking for other pathways for the bill. It does essentially what is happening in New Jersey in terms of having every town take on its fair share of affordable housing, and then having the local control to plan and zone for that housing. And we've run the numbers. This would mean a tremendous benefit for the state in terms of additional income on the order of billions of dollars coming into Connecticut residents, additional tax revenue at the state and local level, both on the order of billions of dollars, and about 80,000 jobs over 10 years for people in Connecticut. So it would be really transformational to Connecticut in all kinds of ways, not just with zoning, but I think it could transform the way that the legislature operates to be thinking about low-income families in particular and issues of equity more generally. So I think it's a really important thing to be supporting. And there's some other things. There's some bills on something called housing authority jurisdiction, which would allow housing authorities, which are really some of our best affordable housing developers in the state, to not be restricted to doing that development only in the town in which they were established, but if they go through the zoning process in another town, just play the role that any affordable housing developer would play in those towns. So, I think one thing this year that has been exciting is we are bringing, attention to these issues. These issues are getting coverage in the press. There's a lot of, I think Sara and I have both gone out to completely unexpected towns that you never knew would have been interested in addressing exclusionary zoning. And, dozens and dozens and sometimes 200 people will show up to hear about this. And that's exciting. And I think there's momentum there. And I think we really have to sort of capitalize on that and move it forward. I think this year is actually the best year to do it. Not only because of concerns about racial issues, but also next year is an election year. And I think it's going to be tricky to get some of this stuff through that, with an election looming out there.
Great. So there's a couple of comments in the chat. I just want to roll a couple of them together. A comment about landlords sort of screening of tenants requiring extraordinary amounts of income in order to select a tenant. And another question about whether Section 8 vouchers can be used anywhere in the state. And I just wanted to take those together because I think they get to kind of the same issue, which is that when you have as few multifamily and as few rental units as we do here in the state of Connecticut, you really put tenants at a disadvantage in terms of their negotiating power. Connecticut happens to have a state law. It's one of a small number of states that has a state law that requires landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. You can't discriminate somebody on the basis of source of income. But if a town doesn't have any rental units or has very few rental units, then it doesn't really matter. A renter is not going to be able to find a rental unit in that town in which to use their Section 8 voucher. And I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk last summer, and just out of curiosity, I was using the zoning map of Guilford, and I just went on to Zillow to see if there are any rentals available in Guilford. And I said, oh my gosh, there's actually like 6 or 7. That's more. I was expecting 0. And it turned out that 2 of them were rentals and the rest were boat slips. So that gives you a sense of the rental market in a number of these towns. So I think we have an audience that's really hungering for some advice on what they can do. So I want to turn to that and then also turn to the Q&A. I'll sort of start us off. I think this is maybe the hardest question of like, what can an individual person do about these extraordinarily difficult problems? Because we're speaking to donors, I would put it out there that one initial thing that we can all do is think about how our giving impacts racial equity. One example is related to a question in the Q&A from Liza Petra on land trust properties. One example is that a lot of money in the state of Connecticut, both public dollars and private nonprofit and donor dollars, goes to open space preservation. And the bulk of that open space preservation happens in high opportunity, disproportionately white towns. And the people who benefit from that open space preservation are the people who live close by and therefore can use that open space for recreational and other purposes. And the people who live in those towns whose the cost of the housing they own is inflated by the lost opportunity to build additional housing in their towns. I think if more donors applied a racial equity lens to their giving, you could see open space being acquired and preserved in places where low-income people, more people of color could actually access and use that space, and it wouldn't take away from housing opportunities. So for a Donors Roundtable, I'd put that out there as one thing to think about in terms of what we can all do. It's worth noting that Connecticut's also pretty special in the extent to which our towns will acquire open space for the express purposes of avoiding housing construction. That's a pretty nutmegger phenomenon. We're really accustomed to seeing it, but it's not particularly common in other parts of the country.
I'll totally second that that point, because one of the things that we have seen is exactly that. There's so much land that's being designated, set aside for no development, that we are shutting off the supply. Now you might say, oh, boy, are you contradicting yourself? Actually, what I think should happen is that we should, in tandem with protecting necessary and important environmental assets and environmental lands, and stewarding our historic assets, we need to enable housing to be produced in smart places. If you dig deep into our zoning map, you can see that even around train stations, they're up and down the Connecticut coast, and actually up to the Waterbury line, and even in some places on the Hartford line, what is allowed around train stations is large lot single family zoning. So our zoning rules are stopping people from building multifamily housing or even 2 to 4 unit housing in places where it's environmentally smart to do so. So if we're not letting people build in large swaths of town X, we need to let people build a lot of housing around the train stations. So you have to do both. So every dollar that you spend on every dollar that a town puts toward that open space, they should almost have to pair it with rezonings that will enable more housing to be built in other places in that town, because there is, if you look at places like Martha's Vineyard, where this has been studied, Nantucket, where this has been studied, as more and more space is protected, which again, I'm an environmentalist, 100%, preservationist, 100%, but the more and more land that we protect, we have to also allow land to be developed. So I just put that out there.
And I would also say, and I consider myself an environmentalist as well, I think it's what we really don't want as environmentalists is for our strong feelings about how we need to preserve the environment to be used as an excuse not to do affordable housing. And even within the last couple of months, we've been working to help a developer of affordable housing get a project done in a Fairfield County town, and we've been they've been approached by neighbors who say, oh my God, the environment, what's going to happen? Well, we ran the numbers in the neighborhood where this proposal has been floated. 56% of the land is in environmental conservation. So the notion that there's a danger here because of this one project proposal is really ludicrous and absolutely being used as an excuse. And Anika, to your point about sort of how donors might think about this, I mean, I think this whole issue is something of a ruby slipper issue. We actually have had the power to deal with this all the time. We just need to support efforts to do it. And I think we've been very fortunate over the last year in particular to get support from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to look at this issue, from the Connecticut Bar Foundation, from the Grasstein Memorial Fund. And it works. It giving resources to be doing the important data research, to be doing the outreach and education to change hearts and minds. That is going to be part of how we solve this. And then the advocacy to actually change things.
There's a good question in the Q&A about home ownership. So we've talked about the racial wealth gap. One giant chunk of the causation of that wealth gap is home ownership itself. Most people's wealth is tied up in their homes. But a lot of our policy proposals have to do with rental housing. Not exclusively. People hear multifamily and they conflate it with rental, but of course it's not. There's co-ops and condos are a form of multifamily housing. But I'm curious to hear from both of you how you think about that issue and how it fits into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on accessory dwelling units. One of the very surprising things that we found out, sorry for the construction outside my house, from the zoning atlas, is that accessory dwelling units are not allowed in several of our biggest cities. So if you look at who owns homes in those cities, it's Black and Latino homeowners, more at least than in outlying areas. For example, Waterbury and Stamford do not allow accessory dwelling units at all. So what does that mean when all of the surrounding suburbs allow for homeowners to create them in some form or fashion, regulated, maybe requiring a public hearing or having some prohibitions, but they are allowed to be created in many suburbs? It means that homeowners in Waterbury and Stamford cannot capitalize on the value of their home in a way that they would if they were able to create an accessory dwelling unit and rent it out to someone. So we in Hartford, before we changed the zoning regulations in 2016, I was on the commission at the time, we legalized accessory dwelling units and they were not legalized before. Right now, New Haven is undergoing a process to review whether it can legalize accessory dwelling units, which for any of you in New Haven, they could certainly use your support to public comment and supporting that. But what we are finding is that of course, as Erin said, nationally, home ownership has been far out of reach for too many families. And in Connecticut, in some ways, zoning policies actually prevent people from accessing that because they take away some opportunities that would allow them to capitalize on the value of their homes. And ADUs is one example of that.
Well, and I think, I can't tell you how many times I've gone out and talked to a group in a suburban community, and we go through sort of all the needs and all of these maps, and the conclusion is, well, maybe we can do some affordable home ownership. So, in terms of what has immediate political appeal, it is that. And I think it's because of the understanding of how home ownership can help to build wealth. So we should do that. And we should think about, one of the ways to help with that is to have smaller lot sizes. So you don't have to buy 2 acres of land to build the maybe smaller size house that you're interested in building. But I think we can't run away from the fact that rental housing there's just a huge hole in our state. We need that. And affordable rental housing puts a family on a path to eventually maybe becoming homeowners. And if a family is very low income and spending half of that very low income on their housing costs, there's no way they're going to be able to save for home ownership. So if we can be investing in affordable home ownership that maybe has even helped with subsidies or helped with, other benefits like Section 8, that's going to stabilize a family and also put them in a position to eventually be homeowners.
Yeah, there's no question. I think, Erin, the numbers from Open Communities Alliance's Fair Share Housing report in terms of the number of households. Yeah, it's your report, and then also I think the partnership had a report in the fall that described the number of households in the state that are housing cost burdened, which is to say they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, or severely housing cost burdened, which is to say they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. I think 2 things. One, a significant number of homeowners in the state of Connecticut are severely housing cost burdened. So the home ownership in and of itself is not a solution to the affordability problem. But if you're severely cost burdened as a renter, which is a significant number, something like 30% of renters in the state of Connecticut pay more than 50% of their income on rent, if I'm remembering correctly, there's no way you're ever going to achieve home ownership. So,
and it's 1 in 6 overall. 1 in 6 overall are severely cost burdened. So if 30% of renters, there's still a sizable number of homeowners that pay more than 50% of their income on rent. That
right.
Cost burden figure for 30% of your income is actually reflected in the zoning atlas. So if you click on any community, it'll also pull up the percentage of non-white residents, as well as the percentage of people who are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So you can see it in your own town, and you might be surprised to see that many wealthy towns have extremely high cost burden for those communities.
So there's a question in the chat from Bob Congdon about prioritizing. So he asks, should the priority for public funds be more vouchers, or should it be more funding for building multifamily housing? I'll just note at the outset that nationally, just 1 out of 5 households that's eligible for a housing voucher actually receives one. So they're not as of right the same way food stamps, for example, are. So obviously there's a great deal of need. So I'll tie that together with a question in the Q&A about the American Rescue Plan funding and ask you both, what's your funding wish list? If there's money out there, and there is some now, where should it go?
Yeah, and I would say it's a great question, but you can't use a voucher if you don't have a unit. So we really kind of need to do both. And my understanding is that we are likely to see more funding of vouchers coming from the federal government. I mean, there's even some proposals out there to make vouchers what's called universal, meaning that anyone who income qualifies, who's low income enough to qualify, could get one. And I mean, that would be a truly transformative thing if it could get funded. So ultimately, we need to do both because we need units for people to move into. And then the other big wish list item I have is sewer infrastructure. I think it's very clear, and we're actually in the process of doing a very deep dive into a dozen towns in the state, into their zone, into their sort of asking the question, why isn't there affordable housing in this town? And a lot of it is about zoning infrastructure. So we're having money coming to Connecticut from the federal government. We actually could earmark some of that money for towns that don't have a lot of affordable housing to, have sewer expanded in those towns or created. So I think that's one item on my wish list.
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
There's a question in the Q&A about 830G. So for the non-wonks out there, that's Connecticut's Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Act, which has been in place for about 30 years, modeled on Massachusetts Anti-Snob Zoning Act, which has been in place in Massachusetts since 1969. Whoever named it in Massachusetts did a way better job than the person who named it in Connecticut. So I've just started calling it the Anti-Snob Zoning Act here too, about the efficacy of 830G. So this is a statute that allows developers of affordable housing to essentially go to court if they're denied zoning approvals on the basis of something, well, allows them to go to court. And then in court, they have the opportunity to demonstrate that their zoning denial was based on something other than health and safety. And if they prevail, then they're entitled to build the thing that they sought to build. There's a question about the efficacy of that. Thousands of units have been built as a result of 830G. It still requires developers to go through a remarkably onerous process that oftentimes carries over many, many, many months and then go to court. And I think what we've seen in Connecticut is that there aren't a lot of developers that want to build their business model around being in a constantly adversarial position vis-a-vis towns and zoning boards and be constantly in court and at the whims of zoning boards and judges. So there are there are thousands of units in Connecticut that exist today because of 830G, and the towns in which they're located never would have permitted those units to have been built any other way, without a doubt. And therefore, thousands of households that have benefited from that statute, but it's not a fix-all. Erin.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, and I know we're running short of time, so I'll be efficient. One thing that was, I think, hoped for when 8-30G was passed is that it would inspire towns to do the planning necessary to create more affordable housing in their towns. And what has happened instead is it's sort of like affordable housing Russian roulette. The towns just sit around and sort of wait in many cases for a developer to come, and then they fight them like hell. So it hasn't really worked out the way they had hoped. And that's part of how we came to this fair share planning and zoning model, because rather than having lots of cases for every single little town, for every single little development, you have one process for one town, and you can change it all together and within a planned manner.
Well, I want to thank you both so much and turn it back over to our host at the Community Foundation.
So thank you, Anika. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Sara. We are honored to be part of stepping forward with you. And thank you for your time and your expertise today. And thank you to the audience who participated. We did record this session, and we will be sending a follow-up email with some resources to the organizations that each of the panel members are involved with, and other ways that you can learn more about this issue. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge my behind the scenes colleagues. You saw a brief cameo of Bigby. He was very involved in putting this program together, and then Carmen Burgos also. So thank you to them. There is an evaluation at the end of this program. So if you could take a few minutes to fill it out and then also share with us any other topics of interest. So thanks again. Wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.